monitoring the chat. Monitoring the chat. And if you have any questions, please put them into the chat function. Tonight's event will be recorded, as you have just been told, and tomorrow you will receive a link for the recording and a short online survey. As a charity, you are supporting us by simply attending this event. Of course, if you want to go further, you can do so in two ways. First, you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. We are literally everywhere. We're even on TikTok. We also have a monthly newsletter, so you can keep up to date with our work, events, and you can tell all your friends. Second way is to consider making a donation to us. As a charity, every penny counts. Hannah will now share those links in the chat. Tonight's event is the final installment of our Changing Perspectives series. This series explores new thinking around issues such as hate crime, extremism, and discrimination. It is a great privilege that we are joined by a panel of experts to explore two streams of the government's anti-terrorism program, Prevent and Protect. Chairing the panel tonight is Hannah Randall, our producer for learning events here at the Centre. Hannah is a qualified teacher and has just completed her MA in Education, in which she focused on extremism and cohesion by studying the implementation of Prevent within secondary schools. Hannah, I will now pass it on to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Chelsea. I'll just pin our panelists. There you go. So, welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you can join us tonight and that we have this brilliant panel with us. So, tonight we are joined by Figen Murray. Figen lost her son Martin in the terrorist attack at Manchester Arena in 2017. Since then, she has appeared on radio, television, and speaks on events about the dangers of radicalisation, tolerance, kindness, and peace. She's working with the government to bring about Martin's Law into the statute book and make security in public venues a legal requirement. She's recently completed her MA in counter-terrorism and has also been awarded an OBE for her work in counter-terrorism. We're also joined by Professor Paul Thomas, who is a Professor of Youth and Policy and Associate Dean of Research at the School of Education and Professional Development at the University of Huddersfield. Paul's research focuses on how policies such as the Prevent strategy have been understood and implemented at ground level. His research with colleagues was the first national study into how Prevent works and how it's been implemented across the country, and is also a qualified youth and community worker. Finally, but certainly not least, we're joined by Sean Arbuthnot. Sean has been a Prevent practitioner since 2013 and is currently the Prevent coordinator for Birmingham. He's also a fellow at the Centre for Analysis of the Radical Right. Prior to that, he enjoyed a 12-year policing career and has a master's in conflict resolution from Lancaster University. So welcome all. Before we get started, let me just, for a bit of context for our audience who may have heard of Prevent, they may have heard of Protect, let me just clarify what we mean by those terms. So the government's counter-terrorism strategy, known as Contest, was introduced in 2018, and it's got 4 strands: Prevent, Protect, Prepare, and Pursue. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on Prevent and Protect. Prevent aims to identify those who are vulnerable to radicalisation and stop them becoming terrorists, whereas Protect looks at how we can strengthen the infrastructure to protect the public from terrorist acts. Although they are looking at two different areas of counter-terrorism, there are lots of connections, which is the aim of this event. So first of all, if we just go around the panel and explain how the work we do either works within Prevent or within Protect, or a bit of both. Paul, we'll go to you first.
Good evening, everyone. Prevent has very much been implemented through educationalists to a large extent. It's in the first phase, it was implemented very much through youth and community workers. And that's how I became involved in researching it. It's in the last few years, it's focused much more on being implemented through education. through the prevent duty that we're going to be speaking about today, whereby all educational staff in schools, colleges, universities, as well as in other health and welfare settings, so all frontline professionals have a duty to implement prevent by identifying people that may be becoming radicalized and referring them into what's known as the channel scheme. So that's how I've been very much involved in researching how educationalists have experienced this duty and this responsibility, and how they've implemented prevent as it's changed.
Brilliant. Sean?
Thanks, Hannah. Evening, everybody. So yeah, I'm currently the Prevent Coordinator for Birmingham City Council. I've been in post for about 3 or 4 weeks now, but I've worked in Prevent since 2013, as Hannah said. First of all, as a police officer, where I effectively managed caseloads in terms of working with vulnerable people who would be referred to the Prevent programme. And then ultimately, having left the police, became a Prevent Coordinator and working first in Leicester and, like I said, now in Birmingham. And my role basically involves having broad strategic oversight as to how Prevent is delivered locally, because as Paul alluded to, it involves a number of different sectors under the legal duty. So you've got education, health, probation, prisons, local authorities, police, you name it. And so I work with all of those different partner agencies in Birmingham to try and make sure we're all singing off the same hymn sheet and delivering Prevent well locally. And that involves supporting the local channel panel. It involves managing various projects throughout the city, community engagement, and a whole host of other things. It's a really interesting and varied role.
And finally, Figen.
Well, I'm professionally not working in prevent. Obviously, I know about it. I'm more working sort of in the domain of protect, as we'll discover later. But I feel that both prevent and protect go hand in hand. So I do some work in prevent by going to schools and talking to young people about the dangers of online radicalization, because I feel prevention is better than cure. Yeah, so.
Brilliant. And finally, myself, so I'm a primary teacher by training, and all the work we do here at the Holocaust Exhibition Learning Centre is, although Holocaust specific, we consider how we can use that to stop acts like this and events like this as well. So for those in our audience, many of you have probably heard of Prevent, but it'll be the sort of controversies around Prevent in the media and things like that. Paul and Sean, can you just explain to us a few of what those are and whether they still exist and things like that?
Maybe if I start, Sean. As I alluded to earlier, Prevent has actually changed and developed a lot over time since it was introduced in 2006. But it has been controversial from the start. And I'd argue those controversies really are about what Prevent was when it was first introduced. In its first 5 years, it only focused on the Muslim community. That was an explicit sort of aim of the policy. So it's concerned with sort of Al-Qaeda or ISIS-inspired extremism. So by only focusing on one section of the community, this was inevitably controversial. It was seen as anti-Muslim. It was seen as partial and unfair at a time when, for instance, the English Defence League and other forms of far-right extremism were growing very rapidly. So that perception that it's only about Muslims and it's overly concerned with Muslims has stayed with it, even though from 2011, when there was a review of Prevent, that it's now been expanded to cover all forms of extremism. But through the referral process, whereby individuals who are viewed as vulnerable are referred into the channel process of Prevent, young Muslims have still been overrepresented. That is changing, and Sean's in a much better place to give us a sense of like what's happening now. But that perception that Prevent is unfairly about Muslims remains live for some people, and that's the main controversy, I think, about Prevent.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with what Paul's just said. Funnily enough, when I started working in Prevent, it was after 2011 and that particular review. So I couldn't quite understand why people regarded it as so controversial, because to me, working within it, I saw it as kind of a public health-led safeguarding approach. And alongside that, I always found there to be a wee bit of a disconnect between how Prevent was viewed at a local level by people who had experience of it in practice, and then the broader national debates around it. But in saying that, I think it would be a wee bit, I don't know if arrogant's the right word, or naive to think that it's not without controversy and complexity. And as Paul said, there's no getting around it. We have to hold our hands up. In those early days of Prevent implementation, it was disproportionately focused on Muslim communities. And that's because the perception at that time was that the main threats and risks came from homegrown terrorists inspired by groups like Al-Qaeda. I think we still live with that legacy to a certain extent. I think that even though Prevent has evolved considerably since then, there are still people for whom it just cannot escape that particular inauspicious beginning. I also think that we're partly responsible for the controversies ourselves, in that Prevent could have been a bit more open and transparent in those early days. I think there was a perception that it was this secret government program, and that wasn't deliberate on our part by any stretch. It just was, I guess, the fact that we didn't see the need to shout about our work a great deal. So there was no malice involved, I guess. It just was in that void then a lot of criticisms and negativity surfaced, and we weren't quick enough to respond to it. And I think the Home Office in particular have gotten a good deal better at that in recent years. We see that with the annual release of channel statistics, for instance. I think there's still some more work that we can do in terms of our openness and transparency, but I think we're getting there. And I think the last thing I would say, just in respect of the controversies around Prevent, would be that, you know, it's fair to say, I think anyway, that there is a fairly strong, small, but vocal anti-Prevent lobby of individuals and organizations. I think they would be opposed to any counter-extremism strategy, to be perfectly honest with you. And I think that they'll always be there. What concerns me more would be the kind of mainstream, credible voices who would be critical of Prevent. And I think it's incumbent upon us to try and engage with them and listen to them as best we can. And we haven't been helped in recent years by, I think, the role that the media, for instance, has played. So I think if you're the average person on the street, all you would really hear about Prevent would be negativity from case studies, for example, that have gone wrong or that have been exaggerated or misreported, shall we say, in recent years. And we're not so hot at getting the good news stories out there, you know? So it's not clear cut. There are controversies. Some of them are unfair, I would say, but I have to hold our hands up and say that some of them are of our own making as well. And we're doing our best to try and reverse that narrative, I guess.
Yeah, when I've just done my MA looking at how secondary school teachers view Prevent, and what I found was that teachers were still scared to report in case they seemed racist, and were over-reporting certain groups of students and not. So I think those controversies are still there, like you say, Sean. Is this system a foolproof system? No, we know it works, but do people fall through the gaps?
It's not foolproof. No, never in a million years. And it never will be, unfortunately. I hate to say it, but I don't think we'll ever be in a position where we'll be able to stop 100% of terrorist attacks. That's just the reality. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, terrorism has become increasingly unsophisticated these days. The rise of lone actor terrorists, for instance, the simplicity of terrorist attacks means it's very difficult to be ahead of the game as far as all of those sorts of plots are concerned. We're seeing new, evolving, emerging threats all the time. We've seen it just in the last couple of years, partially through the COVID pandemic. We're dealing with new threats and risks. There have historically been cases, and I don't want to talk about specific cases, but we all know that there have been individuals who have gone on to commit atrocities, and they have had a footprint with either the security services or with Prevent. And it's a bit of a difficult situation, I think, for the authorities as far as that's concerned, because they're kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. You know, every time there's a terror attack, understandably, people would ask the question, was this individual known to authorities? And if the answer is yes, then there's been a failing somewhere along the way, hasn't there? But at the same time, if the answer is no, and they're not known to the authorities, well, then that's altogether worse as far as I'm concerned. So it sounds counterintuitive, and I need to be careful about how I word this, but I personally am somewhat, like I said, this sounds silly, but I'm reassured by the fact, because that demonstrates that we're looking in the right place, that warning signs are being spotted, that individuals are being referred to us. And it may well be that mistakes can be made. It may well be that individuals don't necessarily consent to prevent support, because ultimately engagement with the channel program is voluntary. There have been cases in the past where individuals have demonstrated what we call disguised compliance. So they pretend to go along with the interventions and they continue their attack planning in the background, and we need to be cognizant of that. And we're dealing with human beings and human nature at the end of the day as well. So I don't think we're ever going to get anything that is 100% effective. And, you know, prevent is just one part of the puzzle. It's not going to cure all ills. It's only one element of our wider counter-terrorism strategy. So we're never going to get it right all the time. So the only sort of plea that I would have is that we don't necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater. We recognize the things that work and that work well, and we develop them and we improve them, but we also hold our hands up when we get it wrong, and we acknowledge it and we learn from it, and we participate in inquiries and make sure that mistakes don't repeat themselves, because I don't want to be a part of a program that's making people's lives worse, not better, you know.
The other thing I'd sort of add to sort of agree with all Sean's comments is this generic thing about prevention, that any form of prevention can never be totally foolproof, because you're dealing with what might happen in the future. And Sean mentioned this sort of referrals from prevent to channel. There's about 7,000 to 7,500 a year, but only a small proportion of those are deemed serious enough to go on and then get a form of intervention, whether it's counselling or mentoring. And when we did the first national survey at Huddersfield with colleagues from Coventry and Durham universities about how schools and colleges were implementing this prevent duty, we posed to teachers, doesn't this mean it's not effective, that you're referring a lot of these people because because most referrals do come from the education sector, but only a small proportion go forward for action. So doesn't that show it's inefficient? But what they said to us was, well, that's true of other forms of safeguarding. And you make these referrals, but if they're not deemed serious enough, that shows there's a high bar for intervention. And we're making very careful judgments, because intervening in a young person's life and bringing an intervention is a very serious thing. So it's actually being quite proportionate. So that the fact that a small proportion only go forward shows that there's a lot of careful judgments being made, but they are judgments about what harm might that person get involved in the future. And that's one reason why it can't be foolproof, alongside the others that Sean's identified about it being voluntary, about people who are being radicalized playing the game and refusing to really engage sincerely with the process. So, you know, but these are not just challenges about extremism, they're challenges about other forms of social harm, whether that's involvement in violent gangs, involvement in drug activity, etc. People do similar things.
Considering that, how then can we improve, you know, as we mentioned, some people who have gone on to carry out atrocities have been in contact with prevent. Figen, is there anything you want to add here at this discussion on this bit?
I can't directly answer your question that you just asked, but what we talked about previously, I feel like Sean mentioned, the media have a huge role to play, and I so wish there would be more good news stories about prevent, because the media can really influence people's opinion about it. If you just hear negative things all the time about prevent, people will have a negative attitude and don't even listen to it properly then, because they're in that negative mindset. So I do wish the media would actually focus more on, well, simply not more, they hardly ever say anything positive. I just wish they would respond positively.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd just add, Hannah, that, you know, Sean mentioned how how limited the sort of positive media coverage has been. But I'd go further and say government hasn't helped itself, because they've been very unwilling historically to share what Prevent actually involves, certainly in that side of it that involves mentoring or counselling. When they have shared actual examples or allowed journalists access to casework with individuals, it's got a very, very positive reaction. One example from recent times in the Yorkshire area was a 14-year-old white young man who was looking at how to make explosives. He had family members who were neo-Nazi involved, essentially, and he was heading towards far-right violence. And his counselling actually came from a Muslim imam, because a lot of his, the central focus for him was hatred of Muslims, and that really turned him around. And when that was shared in the regional media, it had a very powerful reaction on people who had been negative to Prevent, because it both explained what Prevent actually involves, but also it foregrounds the challenge if someone is really engaging in very dangerous ideas. How do you change their trajectory and change their mentality? But because there's been this secrecy, as Sean alluded to, around Prevent, it's really not helped people's justifiable fears about what is this scheme about, what's it involve, is it infringement of civil liberties? And the lack of transparency has really undermined it historically as a scheme, and it's got somewhat better, but as someone who doesn't work for Prevent, I still think it's pretty poor at explaining what it does and why it does it.
Go on, Sean.
I was just going to say it's hard to disagree with what Paul's just said. Managing risk is always difficult, and there's always going to be an inherent sort of aversion to taking risks when it comes to things like, I mean, last summer, for instance, I and my wife were at the wedding of a former neo-Nazi who had been one of the first referrals to Prevent and had gone through the Channel programme, and now has completely turned his life around from being in the darkest place imaginable to being a real benefit to the society at large around him. And, out of respect for him and his anonymity and everything else, that's not a story that we would necessarily share publicly, but it's just an indication of some of the work that goes unheard of, really, in the Prevent space. If we're talking about things that we can do to improve it, I've got a list. I'm not going to go through it with you right now. There's an independent review of Prevent that has been taking place over the last sort of year, 18 months, and we're hopefully going to hear what its conclusions are fairly soon. So I don't necessarily want to preempt it, but I did sit down with the review team last year and went through my list, which gets into the weeds and gets into some real specific things. It's about funding, it's about consistency of delivery, improving the standard of training, improving openness and transparency, sharing good news stories, those sorts of things. But yeah, it remains to be seen whether or not they've listened to me or not.
Before we move on to sort of bring the protect element in, Sean, you're probably best placed. Could you we've talked about how at the beginning it was Muslim focused. Could you just sort of explain what the kind of referrals are now? If it's just Muslims, what other things are being referred to you guys?
It's a real mixed bag at the moment, to be honest with you. I mean, when I started working in Prevent, 50% of my caseload related to right-wing extremism. And it's important, I think, that we're always responsive to new and evolving risks and threats. And so I think what we're seeing at the moment, well, certainly this would be borne out in the national statistics that have been released recently. 51% of our current referrals nationally for the last 2 years have involved individuals with what we would call a mixed, unclear or unstable ideology. It's a bit of a catch-all, to be honest with you. And then the rest are evenly divided pretty much between violent Islamist-inspired extremism and right-wing extremism. And then we get a few kind of anomalies thrown into the mix as well. So I've had a handful of Irish-related cases, for instance, that I've dealt with at a local level. But this bigger category, if you like, of mixed, unclear, unstable would involve those cases where it isn't immediately obvious that there's a political ideology that's influencing somebody. So it could be an individual who takes an interest in several ideologies at once. Maybe it's someone with an interest in right-wing extremism with a bit of incel subcultures thrown in there as well. It could be someone with an unclear ideology. So, maybe no political motivation, but an aspiration to commit some kind of mass violence, like a school shooter fixation, for example. We see a lot of cases to this day that are inspired by US mass shootings like Columbine, for instance. And then we've even had the unstable cases where individuals have in some instances been referred to channel for Islamist-inspired extremism. They're dealt with through the channel program. And then a few years later, they cross our paths again for right-wing extremism. So it's a real mixed bag. I don't want to overemphasize the importance of it, because in amongst that 51% is just a whole range of different ideologies and issues, etc. But it's definitely the case that our workload has somewhat expanded, and we do see all sorts. And like I briefly mentioned earlier on, the COVID pandemic has partially contributed to that, with the increasing role that the online space plays in radicalization and in the rise of, conspiracy theories and things like that. Not that they would necessarily meet the threshold for prevent support or intervention, but I think if violence is a factor in any kind of ideological thinking, then it would be something that we would look at in the prevent space. So yeah, a bit of everything, unfortunately.
Brilliant. So prevent is currently a legal duty, meaning that we have teachers or anyone who thinks they have a legal requirement in the education sphere to report. And Figen, you're campaigning for a protect legal duty. Can you first explain what you're campaigning for, Figen? Oh, you're still on mute.
Gosh, how many times have we all said that over the last 2 years? Sorry. So I'm campaigning for Martin's Law, which is it's going to be the amended protect duty. Laws in the UK are not named after a dead person, unfortunately. But it doesn't really matter. It's not about Martin's name. It's the protect duty will hopefully mean that security at public venues, or what the government calls publicly accessible locations, is going to become a legal requirement, because up to now, although the protect duty is a legal duty under the contest document, unfortunately it is flawed in so far that venues are only recommended to put security in place, which I find incredible, because the main reason for that is obviously in sort of around 2014, the attack methodology of terrorists has changed, and actually, it is no longer possible for the police, counter-terrorism, MI5, the government, to keep every terrorist in check. It's impossible, because people are increasingly getting radicalized in their bedroom, online, and they're completely often under the radar of any authority. So attacks could happen literally anywhere, anytime, any place, and therefore carried out by anybody. So I think that's why the protect duty is so important when we are out and about, that when we go to a venue, the venue has to put security in place to keep you safe.
That's my turn to be muted. And do we think legal duties work? Is prevent being a legal duty working? Do we think that protect duty, when it becomes a legal duty, will it work in protecting the public?
I suppose the first thing to say about the prevent duty was the idea of a legal duty on all those people we had identified was pretty controversial in itself when it's first introduced, because it was fairly internationally unprecedented to have a specific legal duty about extremism. And I do a lot of research with international colleagues, and I was going to different countries, and people said, what's Britain doing? You're turning all these police and health and welfare people into arms of the state, into spies. So the idea was controversial. Why did government bring it in? Well, I think a lot of people who'd been involved in terrorist plots or traveled to Syria, which is a very big issue when in 2015, when the duty came in, a lot of those people either were currently in schools, colleges, universities, or had only very recently left. And there was a feeling that there wasn't enough being done. I think what the legal duty has done is ensure the uniformity of approach. And Sean mentioned a lack of uniformity in a lot of what Prevent does. Well, it ensures that all frontline personnel across all those sectors have received a certain amount of training. And I was at a seminar with the head of nursing for the health service who talked about almost like 1 million staff across the NHS having some form of Prevent training. And certainly hundreds of thousands of educationalists have had training when it was first, dedicated training when it first came in. So it does ensure that. Is it such a big deal? Well, it felt from the outside, as I said, like a very big deal and a very big change. But the research we did in schools and colleges found that people who worked there said in practice, it isn't such a big change because we see it as part of safeguarding, and we already have safeguarding systems. It asks us to teach about British values, but we already teach about values. We already teach about citizenship. So although it's a legal duty that's inspected, it's not actually such a big change. But what the duty does is ensure a uniformity and that people all have to go through the same systems and the same training.
There's not a massive amount to add to what Paul's just said. He's absolutely right. It was controversial when the legal duty first came in, and it was a game changer. And I think in the long run, it's worked out for the best. I think the fears that critics had about teachers and GPs being turned into agents of the state has been misplaced. In actual fact, the legal duty itself, it's not intended to be onerous. It's essentially an extension of people's existing safeguarding duties. And some people get, I suppose, confused by the language in the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, which isn't particularly helpful, if I'm honest with you. It states that people need to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. But what that essentially means is there's an expectation that public sector workers in all of those agencies that we previously mentioned are expected to have a general awareness of what the risks may be. They're not expected to be experts in this complex field by any stretch, just an awareness of the general issues and a specific awareness of what to do if they've got concerns. So know how to make a referral. And like I mentioned, those earlier fears, I think, have proved unfounded. I stand to be corrected, but I don't know of anyone who has been prosecuted for failing to implement the Prevent duty or show due regard. It's an organizational responsibility. And as Paul mentioned, it's brought consistency. So there's now a baseline standard of safeguarding across the board, particularly in channel panels, which is the most important element of Prevent. It's ensured that deeper understanding of a public health approach, and it's raised the awareness of people across the board. And so I think it's a really positive thing that the Protect duty is imminent and is potentially going to have the same impact. What I would say to sort of policymakers and people who are involved in implementing it would be, take a look at what we've done, the things we did well, the things we did badly, and learn from the mistakes that we made along the way in terms of that consistency and training and openness and transparency and getting the message out there. And hopefully we've kind of pioneered that and made all the mistakes that needed to be made. So hopefully the Protect duty will be implemented a bit more smoothly than Prevent. We'll see.
From Figen.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at a question of Julia about the Protect duty. Well, you know, when Martin died, I hadn't realized, because I was just a member of the public, and I went to concerts like everybody else and all these venues, and saw people in high-vis jackets, and made the assumption that they're security and they know what they're doing because they're officially employed by the venue. Little did I know that actually people may not even be trained in security. They may just be stewards or volunteers. And I was horrified, which is why I obviously set up the campaign. And I was horrified that there is such a thing as the Protect duty, but within that was this massive gap, huge gap, because it was only a recommendation. How could that possibly be that we can go to concerts in any big venues and the organizers, the event organizers, the venue has no obligation whatsoever to keep the public and their staff as well safe from terrorism, which I find absolutely incredible, especially when there are health and safety and fire regulations yet there's nothing to specify and mandate security, which is why I'm trying to change things.
And just to add to that briefly, that's a really important point. It's similar to Prevent. Prior to the legal duty in 2015, there was an assumption that people would just get on with it and muddle through and do it themselves. Yeah. What the legal duty ensured was that every sector had an obligation to receive training and to get involved. And so you're not just relying on people's goodwill or common sense in order to safeguard others. And so I think that's one of the key things that the legal duty will hopefully ensure.
Yes, and further to that, I would say that often when venues need to save money, security is usually one of the first things to go, because it's not a mandatory requirement at the moment.
How then do we think, so we've got sort of the prevent side of things, protect, how do we bring these things together? How can they work together? Because at the moment it seems to be very separate, but surely there is a way that we can bring it together to protect the public.
Personally, I think it's an all-round approach. I think, I mean, I don't know if the other people disagree with me who are on the panel. I feel that terrorism nowadays is definitely a social issue, a societal issue, and therefore we need to tackle it from a societal point of view altogether, holistically. It's everybody's responsibility to look after each other and become a more resilient nation. And prevent certainly has a role to play, and the protect duty has a role to play from a completely different side and angle. Certainly prevention, in my view, has to be better than cure. As a mother who lost a child in an attack, I wish that people who had worked at venues would be more educated about it. Maybe things could have turned out differently, I don't know.
Paul, Sean?
I think one form of learning from prevent to protect is that training. There is very considerable staff training throughout all the sectors mentioned when the duty first came in, and that was the bedrock of it moving forward as it did. And obviously, those are public sectors that are used to staff training and updating of training. It's more challenging for venues, but we need to expect that from venues, and they need to be licensed on that basis. I mean, like I can tell by Sean's photos, he's a football, I'm a football fan, and and I've been to a lot of football grounds in the past where the stewarding, for instance, is just not safe. And so we've taken all forms of public safety not seriously enough at venues of all types in the past. And there's been tragedies at sporting venues of just lack of crowd control and safety, let alone threats of violence, as terrorism can be. So we haven't invested enough and required enough investment in training. And I think that's one of the learnings from the prevent duty and the progress it's made, the requirement for training and for a uniformative training and all the required levels. The other comment I'd make is that Figen's highlighting prevention. We've talked a lot in the education space about this referral of people being radicalized, but prevention really focuses on education. And one of the weaknesses of the prevent duty is there probably isn't enough focus on anti-extremist education and building resilience through citizenship, which has been downplayed in the national schools curriculum over the last few years. And that is, I similarly met the Prevent Review panel and highlighted that we need to do more to help people be resilient against extremism, which is broader education. So sorry, I thought I should need to slip that one in because I didn't mention that one earlier.
Just to add, certainly at a local level, we do see a lot of partnership working between the 4 strands of contests. It's not something, I guess, that would be as widely known to the general public, but a lot of regions would have a strategic contest board, for instance, where you get all 4 Ps, if you like, represented: protect, prepare, pursue, and prevent. And you get the key stakeholders from the city or the region, where they would discuss things like resiliency planning for major events, So you can imagine with Birmingham hosting the Commonwealth Games this year, there's a lot of work taking place behind the scenes to ensure that everything's fit for purpose as far as that's concerned. They'll discuss significant court cases as far as Pursue is concerned, counter-extremism projects and things like that. But I do think that, as with everything, it could be improved and it can evolve. You know, at a very hyper-local level, Prevent officers would often work quite closely with counter-terrorism security advisors who work as part of the Protect duty as well. But I'm guessing that that's probably inconsistent across the piece. So yeah, there's always more that we can do to develop and improve, always.
Okay, in a minute we will open the panel up for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, now's your time. I just want to bring in my colleague who I can see in the audience, David Brooke. So David recently graduated alongside me from Paul's MA in education, focusing on extremism. Now, David, graduated in that, but he also works in the security service, private. So, David, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Brooke. I'm a former police officer with West Yorkshire Police, having served 25 years, and then on retirement moved into the private security industry, trying to transfer my skills across. As Hannah stated, I've just completed my Masters in Education and Extremism, and that built on a strong dynamic theme during my honours degree, where I focused on the gangs in the UK and how we could try and prevent gang affiliation. A couple of points that have emerged. Sean mentioned, I believe it was Sean mentioned about the media. The moral panic that was created during the gangs is a similar sort of moral panic that's been created in relation to extremism. And relating that now to my current profession, it sort of touches on what Figen's stating with the Protect duty. Now, I'm mindful that I can't go into any details in relation to the Manchester Arena inquiry. However, my own research focused on UK policy interventions, looking at the prevent and countering violence and extremism, linking to training within the private security industry and how this would impact on publicly accessible locations. Now, I think it'd be fair to give a few sort of common themes which emerged during my own research, which highlighted systemic failings across the industry. And whilst I'm fully in support of the Protect duty, I believe there are a number of barriers which we will have to climb across, most notably the issue of how is this going to be funded? Within the industry, I've witnessed firsthand, as had many of my research participants, how promoters try to cut costs, they cut down numbers, and basically what we have is a bit of terminology which I don't particularly agree with, jacket fillers. Basically putting a member of the public into a high visibility jacket, and they could be stood alongside somebody else, again, who doesn't have the training. Now, my role within private security industry is as a training and development manager, and I'm at the forefront of our professional body, trying to instill better training standards, and I'm delivering training on a weekly basis. And what we find is a lot of the training that is provided, staff don't retain that knowledge. When you go operational and you try assessing them in the on-site location, again, they don't seem to have that level of understanding. And that is my biggest fear, that if we're paying people national minimum wage to keep people safe, we do have a problem. And I think we need to overcome that. And through conversations I've had with Figen previously, I think we've got like minds, and more needs to be done to educate the industry to how we can basically deliver a better level of service, one that has a protective wraparound security at all events, and find the right people to conduct those security risk assessments, ensure that we have the right people filling those jackets with the right level of training, and again, getting over that perception that if they do interact and try to engage with a member of the public who they believe may be involved in terrorism, that they are not being racist because they stop, for example, an Asian male. And for me, it needs a lot more practitioners around the table to ensure that the protect duty is delivered correctly. And I think it is a battle ahead, but I'm 100% in support of that. And I will certainly be doing the most that I can to support Figen and others.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. On one of the points there, David pointed out, I'm interested to see what the other panelists think. Do we think racial sensitivity is something that is preventing referrals and things like that? And is racial sensitivity also an issue when it comes to things like protect as well? How is that impacting both of those? Go on, Figen.
Yeah, so certainly, whilst we're not allowed to talk too much about the Arena inquiry, it's publicly acknowledged because it was obviously on YouTube. There was an issue of racial sensitivity in the Arena attack because some very young security people actually saw the bomber who acted suspiciously, and they had their suspicions and concerns, but were too, certainly one of them was too scared to even take it to their supervisor in case they're accused of being racist. So to me, that goes, and I have absolutely no issue with this young man at all. It wasn't his fault that he behaved like that. It simply is that people have to be trained in how to deal with racial sensitivity. There are ways around it, but that has to happen through proper training. And following on to what David said about training people, I think it's really, really important that the security industry, with the protect duty coming in, there's going to be lots and lots of teething problems. It's going to take possibly years to embed it properly until everybody sings from the same hymn sheet. But it is important to bring it into focus that the whole issue of training can be turned around so that young people are attracted into the security industry as a career choice, as a very desirable career choice with proper professional progression routes where they can go up to management and higher management and middle management positions. And that's what will make the industry safer as well, I think, because you'll have more dedicated staff who do not just work on minimum wage, but they have a decent income, etc. There's a lot of things that have to be changed, like David said, and it'll take time. I thought I can just disappear once the law is in, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. I need to hang around. Yeah, it's a lot of work to be done.
I'd certainly add to that, Hannah, that in education, research clearly shows that racial dimensions do have an impact. The education workforce at all sectors, schools, colleges, university, is overwhelmingly white. And those white educators themselves say they are less certain about how to judge potential radicalization or signs of it amongst, for instance, Muslim young people. They feel more certain about what would possibly be signs of extreme right wing, for instance. Also, like young Muslims, as we said earlier, are overrepresented in referrals, but then they don't lead on to actions. There is some evidence that educators are referring young Muslims for what they think is suspicious, but is actually just signs of increasing religiosity, such as growing a beard or wearing more sort of conservative clothing. Racism is an issue in society. Racial prejudice or racial ignorance is an issue in society, and it does have some impacts on this agenda, and there's no doubt about that. And so that highlights broader needs for broader training, should I say.
We definitely see that at a local level as well. So I would say, anecdotally, based on my own experience, that broadly, people are more comfortable at recognizing the signs of racism, hatred, etc., and so are, I suppose, more likely to make a referral of right-wing extremism. And there's definitely this reluctance to be perceived as racist or culturally insensitive. But at the same time, we still do get a disproportionate number of young people someone may have a concern, and as Paul says, it is simply increased religious conservatism. And so in those cases, we would try to sensitively educate the individual concerned why that's not necessarily a responsible or appropriate referral to be made. I guess my bottom line as far as any of this is concerned is that we're talking about safeguarding at the end of the day, and no one should be criticized for making an honestly held safeguarding concern as long as it's dealt with sensitively and professionally. And so I would always err on the side of caution myself and seek that advice and have that professional conversation in the first instance. If I can just be allowed to make one more wee comment linked to what David was saying about the whole sort of funding issue, because I've got a real bee in my bonnet about this, and you can imagine I mentioned it to the Prevent review team quite a few times. Funding is always going to be an issue, and everyone is always going to ask for more money. There's no doubt about that. In the UK, I believe we spend about £2 billion a year on counter-terrorism. The Prevent budget annually is about £50 million, give or take, which seems like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a drop in the ocean, and it's only 2% of the whole CT budget. And I think the value for money that you get with the types of interventions and things like that Prevent puts in place is unreal. But I still think that in this age of ever decreasing funds, CT could always do with more, because I think a recent study, I think it was the RAND organization, found that in 2017 we had 5 terrorist attacks in the UK. Westminster Bridge, we've just had the 5-year anniversary of. We had London Bridge and Borough Markets, Manchester Arena, obviously, Parsons Green and Finsbury Park Mosque, and all combined they caused approximately £3 billion worth of damage to the UK economy. So never mind the tragic human cost, 36 civilian deaths and over 200 injuries. But when you look at it in cold, hard financial terms, it makes absolute sense to try and prevent this from ever happening in the first place.
David?
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. I saw in the chat, I can't remember who it was, but somebody mentioned surely this comes down to the job of the regulator linking to Ofsted. For me, I think that's a valid point. Within the security industry, we have the SAA, who are the regulator. Unfortunately, they don't have the resources to be able to go out to events to ensure that security staff are actually licensed. And what you will find is within the industry, we're trying to, the genuine people within the industry, of which there are many, are trying to raise standards and deliver training in the right way. Unfortunately, what we have unscrupulous security providers, unscrupulous training providers, who they will take a backhander to say that someone's attended a course, they'll give them a certificate, and basically that then puts non-qualified people out covering events. For me, I think a critical part of the future success for the Protect duty would be to have a regulatory body composing of some of your more credible security organisations going out, in a sense, regulating an event. So, for example, we have the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, if I can use that as a future example, having people on the ground within industry linked to the professional bodies within the industry to go out, check, do we have the people who are allegedly working security at the venue? Are they physically on the post? Identify what training they have, do training checks and balances. I think we would find major flaws and gaps at any venue that we would go to. And I do know it came out in my own research that we even have a system of what we call ghosting within the industry, whereby some security providers say they have, for example, John Smith working at an event. They will claim for John Smith having worked a full shift at that event, but they'll have John Smith and all his other brothers and sisters working at the event, and nobody's actually there. And for me, this comes down to how we try to regulate it to improve standards. And as I say, that my research, I'm happy to share with anybody who wants it. There are problems out there, but we also know what some of the solutions are. And I hope that as a group of stakeholders between us, we can try and support Figen and others to ensure that the Protect duty is a success in the future.
Thanks. I've got one question from the audience to ask. Obviously, you're all joining us because we're the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Centre. Do we see Holocaust denial within Prevent referrals? Sean and Paul, this one probably for you guys?
Yes, in a nutshell. In fact, we see it across all forms of extremism that get referred into as it seems to be a bit of a common denominator, actually, unfortunately, anti-Semitism, whether that's, belief that Jewish elites are taking over the world, whether it's Holocaust denial, whether it's blood libel type stuff, we see them cutting across all forms of extremism, particularly extreme right wing, some Islamist inspired ideologies, even some far left organizations espouse that type of thing. It's really important then that we tailor our interventions and responses to such cases in an appropriate way. And every case that gets referred into Prevent, for instance, is treated on its own merits and tailored according to the individual. And I do remember an early Prevent case that I dealt with of a young lad who was in his mid-teens, who was an out-and-out white supremacist. He was saying things you just would not believe. He talked about a race war being on the horizon, how he was using a crossbow to hunt for small animals in the woods near his house to prepare for this eventuality. And he was openly telling this to two police officers. He was big into his conspiracy theories, and Holocaust denial was a significant one. He was a huge supporter of Hitler-type ideology as well. And so one of the interventions we put in place with him, trying to think outside the box a wee bit, was a cultural visit to the Holocaust Memorial Centre near Nottingham, which is the Beth Shalom Centre, incredible place. And so not only did this little history buff go on the museum tour and see for himself primary evidence of the horror and scale of the Holocaust, and that tapped into some of the historical interests that he had anyway. But at lunchtime, he kind of accidentally on purpose sat him down in the cafe beside a Holocaust survivor. And the pair of them struck up a conversation and chatted for over 2 hours. And so you've got this 15-year-old white supremacist. How can he deny the Holocaust to a living witness to it? Do you know what I mean? The only surviving member of his family had been in a concentration camp at 3 years of age. And that human connection, more than anything else, all the other bits and pieces we put in place, okay, they had an impact, but that human connection made the biggest difference in that young lad's channel journey. And that became a bit of a benchmark, really, for future cases. So whenever kind of Holocaust denial was a feature of Prevent cases, we'd be picking up the phone to the Beth Shalom Centre and seeing if we could bring them along. So it's definitely, unfortunately, a recurring theme, and one that doesn't get talked about often enough as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks. Do any of our panelists want to make any final comments?
Just there's a question and a comment from Clive in the chat about safeguarding, and it is true that this extension of the term safeguarding is not uncontroversial. Some social work sort of researchers feel that what we describe when we describe Prevent as safeguarding is that an unacceptable stretching, but I don't agree. I think it is a public health response, and it is one that works. And actually, it's now extending into the community with the Act Early campaign, which is really trying to give help and support and guidance to people who feel a family member or a loved one is actually getting involved in extremism. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that website. I think it's a very sensitive public health approach. But Clive does also make an important point about the extension of terrorist prosecutions to people who are simply viewing material, and they're now being caught up as terrorist offenders. And that is an international concern that's being debated a lot. I think Clive's absolutely right to identify the creep where it's not just people who are actually planning or carrying out violence, simply viewing or possessing material is now also being viewed as a terrorist offence, and it is catching quite a lot of young people, young adults. And I think that is, Clive's right to identify that some tension between safeguarding and some of the prosecutions there.
Brilliant. Go on, Sean.
I was just going to say, I think the latest terrorism arrest statistics bear that out. The biggest rise in terrorist arrests this past year have been people under 18 years of age. And a lot of those offences that they're being arrested for are possession of materials. In some cases, they've been just a mass download of thousands upon thousands of documents that they couldn't ever hope to read in a lifetime. And unwittingly, they're being caught up in significant terrorism investigations. And that's a massive worry. Whether it's proportionate or not is another question. So that's why I would tentatively suggest that, that upstream early intervention as quickly as possible could hopefully prevent, young people from making those mistakes that could tarnish them for years.
Thank you. So thank you to all our panelists, and David as an extra surprise panelist there. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to hand back over to Chelsea.
Hi, thank you so much, guys. That was such an interesting conversation. And I found it very provocative and very, it was wonderful to see the underlying tensions and how you think that they can be resolved and best addressed. And I felt that that was a very powerful thing. Especially enjoyed Sean's story about the white supremacist meeting a Holocaust survivor. And that resonates so much with the work that Hannah does, that work that I do at the Holocaust Center. So thank you very much for sharing that, and always keep us in mind if you need to meet a Holocaust survivor for those kinds of things. We would love to be involved in that capacity. So if anyone has no more questions, then we're going to conclude with this evening. Of course, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for contributing their time and experiences with us and their knowledge and expertise. Thank you very, very much. And also to the audience for attending tonight. We really, really appreciate your support. And of course, to Hannah for chairing this amazing panel. Well done, Hannah. As I mentioned, tomorrow we will send out the link for the recording along with a short survey. If you can complete the survey, it helps us immensely to ensure that these events are the best that they can be. Hannah will share the link to that survey. And please remember that we have plenty of excellent events planned for this year. You're welcome to join any of them. So please do follow us or sign up for our newsletter and learn about more. Without further ado, thank you so much for attending and supporting us. And I hope you all have a lovely evening, whatever time of day it is for you. Good evening, everyone.
Let's get rid of the last few. There we go.
Well done, guys.